see my patience, I just came here to defend.
Alors, bonsoir tout le monde. Merci d'être venu à ce meet-up numéro 31. Est-ce qu'il y a des gens ici qui viennent pour la première fois? Ok. Ah, pas mal de gens. Et qui est débutant en Docker? Ok. Et qui en utilise tous les jours? Ok. Est-ce que quelqu'un fait du Docker Swarm pour le taf? Ok. Alors, ce soir, on va avoir deux talks. Un de Francis, qui est là. Donc, lui, il va nous parler de Docker Swarm, donc ça tombe bien. Donc, Docker Swarm, c'est pour faire du clustering avec Docker. Et ensuite, on aura une présentation de Diogo Monica. Je ne sais pas s'il est là. Diogo? Non? Il n'est pas là. Non, je crois qu'il était en conférence aujourd'hui, mais il devrait arriver tout à l'heure. Voilà, donc quoi d'autre? Donc on aura deux talks, après on aura la pause pizza. Et je tiens à remercier les deux sponsors qui ont participé à la pause pizza, qui sont Amazon et Google. Normalement il y a des personnes qui devraient être là de chez eux, mais je ne sais pas s'ils sont venus. Alors, est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un d'Amazon ici? Non, personne? Ni de Google? Ok. Bon, bah, merci à eux en tout cas. Voilà, sinon pour ceux, est-ce qu'il y a des gens qui font du front-end ici? Ok, donc on organise la conférence AngularJS au mois d'octobre. Il y aura toute la team de Google qui sera là, le créateur d'AngularJS et de Ionic, et aussi CycleJS pour ceux qui font du RxJS. Et il y aura aussi une formation, voilà, les 25 et 26 octobre. Tac, tac. Je pense qu'on va attaquer avec le talk de Francis. Merci.
Donc moi je m'appelle Francis et je suis développeur à la base Python, puis ensuite beaucoup de Go. Et j'aime bien les containers. J'avais commencé à les utiliser un petit peu avant que Docker, enfin anciennement .cloud, fasse son pivot. Et où à l'époque on s'amusait avec LXC, donc c'était pas très pratique, et Docker a changé pas mal de choses. Et sinon dans la vie, donc je suis CTO et cofondateur d'une boîte qui s'appelle Blueboard et qui est en ce moment hébergée au NUMA, l'accélérateur de start-up parisien. Voilà, et on recherche des stagiaires. J'ai juste une petite démo pour illustrer mon propos, qui est juste une petite visualisation. Donc là, je vais vous la montrer en local. Une petite visualisation toute bête en D3 avec Node.js et D3.js. Donc en fait là, en gros, ce qu'on fait à Blueboard, c'est un outil de monitoring pour les marques d'électronique grand public, pour savoir ce qui se passe auprès des revendeurs en ligne, une fois qu'ils ont vendu leurs produits auprès des revendeurs en ligne. Donc là, on est sur quelques acteurs des casques audio, et en fait la répartition de leur distribution chez les revendeurs en ligne français, quoi. Donc là, par exemple, on voit que les casques Urban Ears, ils sont vendus majoritairement chez Amazon, chez Cdiscount et chez Backshop. Enfin, voilà. Ça, c'est une petite visualisation, c'était juste pour avoir une petite démo à montrer. Donc bon, on est tous d'accord, peut-être que voilà, mais pour Docker c'est bien, c'est même très bien. Typiquement sur une application Node.js comme celle-ci, il y a énormément de dépendances, parce que Node a cette manie de faire des micro-libs. Donc voilà, donc si on regarde un petit peu, voilà, mon écran n'est pas pas terrible du tout comme ça. C'est gentil. Hop, ouais, non, ça va mieux, mais du coup, ça fait vraiment petit tout ça. Tac. Et juste pour vous montrer, quand on regarde, si on fait un npm list pourtant il n'y a vraiment rien dans l'application, hein, c'est assez basique. Si on fait un npm list, on voit que voilà, l'ensemble des dépendances qui sont installés par Node pour une 5 applications. Il doit y avoir Express et 2-3 trucs, enfin vraiment très 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 léger. Donc ça, typiquement, c'est le genre de choses dans un monde avant Docker qui était un petit peu compliqué. Du coup, j'ai perdu ma présentation. Voilà. Ok. Donc voilà, donc là typiquement sur une application comme ça, qu'est-ce qu'on fait? Enfin bon, je dis ça parce qu'effectivement il y a pas mal de gens qui connaissent peut-être pas forcément bien Docker. Ce qu'on va faire, c'est qu'on va faire un Dockerfile qui va nous permettre de builder une image. Et l'image, le gros avantage, c'est qu'elle va être stable et ça nous permet d'avoir un environnement reproductible. Donc en général, ce qu'on fait, c'est qu'on se base sur une image publique, notamment les images officielles qui ont été faites par la team de Docker. Voilà. Donc là, puisque c'est une application Node, on part avec le from du Node, et puis ensuite après c'est deux trois commandes simplement pour copier le package au bon endroit, lancer le npm install pour builder l'ensemble des dépendances, lancer un bower install aussi. Et puis exposer le port sur lequel est servi l'application à l'intérieur du container. Ça, c'est quelque chose pour ceux qui sont pas forcément qui connaissent un peu moins Docker. Ça, c'est quelque chose qui est très important, en fait, c'est le mapping du port. C'est ce qui va faire que cette application qui tourne sur le port 8020 dans le container, en local, elle va être accessible du monde extérieur parce qu'on l'a mappé sur le port 49200 du host. Donc voilà, donc ça, une fois qu'on a fait ça, on lance le Docker build, on run l'application, et donc là, bon, je l'avais fait en amont, donc ça c'est mon localhost, mais voilà, ça c'est sur la machine en question, et voilà, effectivement sur le port 49200 on a ça. Et bien sûr, voilà, derrière, avoir une application web qui fonctionne sur un port exotique comme ça, c'est pas très intéressant. Donc, ce qu'on fait en général derrière, c'est qu'on met un Nginx, par exemple, pour faire un reverse proxy pour pouvoir renvoyer les requêtes vers le conteneur. Donc voilà, donc tout ça c'est très bien, mais le problème c'est que Docker est monoserveur. Donc si on a géré plusieurs hosts, ça veut dire qu'on se connecte avec la ligne de commande ou peu importe le client qu'on utilise, on va se connecter à chacun des hosts pour gérer les différents hosts. Et ça s'explique parce qu'en fait Docker est basé sur 2 fonctionnalités du noyau, et donc c'est vraiment spécifique à chaque host. On a d'un côté les namespaces qui permettent l'isolation des différentes couches, processus, réseau, utilisateurs également, et puis les C-groupes qui permettent de limiter les ressources d'un groupe de processus. Et donc c'est là où rentre en jeu Docker Swarm, qui en fait permet d'avoir un Docker multiserveur. Alors pourquoi est-ce qu'on voudrait avoir un cluster un Docker en cluster? Il y a énormément de raisons pour ça. D'une part, si on a beaucoup de machines, c'est quand même beaucoup mieux de le faire comme ça. Également pour faire de la répartition de charges et de calcul distribué. Ça, c'est un use case assez fréquent. Et surtout, ce qui est à mon avis le cas le plus fréquent, c'est pour assurer la haute disponibilité. Donc le principe général. Alors oui, juste un petit mot sur la question de l'orchestration et du clustering des conteneurs Docker. Il y a beaucoup de gens qui s'y intéressent. Il y a beaucoup de projets. Il n'y a pas que Docker Swarm. Google a Kubernetes qui est aussi en open source. Vous avez également comme acteur Mesos. Mesos avec Mesosphere et DCOS. Enfin voilà, c'est un certain nombre d'acteurs qui s'intéressent à cette question-là. Et donc la proposition de Docker Inc, c'est Swarm. Et en fait, moi, ce qui fait que j'aime bien Swarm, en fait, c'est qu'on n'introduit pas de nouveaux concepts. Si on sait utiliser Docker en monoserveur, on va savoir utiliser Swarm. En fait, le principe de Swarm, c'est que ça agit un peu comme un proxy. La ligne de commande qu'on va utiliser exactement de la même façon que d'habitude va se connecter au host qui servira de Swarm Master, et ensuite lui il va redispatcher les commandes qu'on va effectuer à l'intérieur du cluster. Donc ça permet de ne pas introduire de nouveaux concepts. Par exemple, dans Kubernetes, ils ont un concept de pod qui est tout à fait intéressant, mais on rajoute des couches d'abstraction, alors que là, on reste au moins pour débuter sur quelque chose qui est exactement similaire à ce qu'on fait dans une approche monoserveur, que ce soit en local ou sur un serveur unique. Donc voilà, très concrètement, on a juste à faire pointer la variable d'environnement Docker host vers le swarm, vers le démon Docker swarm, au lieu de le faire pointer vers le démon Docker. Et donc voilà, comme je disais, c'est l'avantage c'est que c'est compatible puisque ça utilise l'API classique du démon Docker, donc c'est compatible avec l'ensemble des outils qui sont basés sur cette API, quoi. Donc bien sûr la ligne de commande, mais également des outils comme Kitematic ou comme Shipyard pour des interfaces graphiques. Donc on va pouvoir utiliser ces différentes commandes. Il y a quelques petites exceptions, par exemple Docker Build qui ne fonctionne pas exactement de la même façon. Mais bon, globalement, c'est un petit peu la même chose. Et donc pour installer un cluster, on a besoin d'un certain nombre d'éléments. Le premier élément qui à première vue peut paraître un petit peu le frein principal, c'est qu'en fait on a besoin d'un service discovery. Donc ils ont prévu heureusement plusieurs choses. On peut commencer par un service public qui est fourni par Docker ou par un simple fichier à plat. Mais effectivement, si on est dans une logique de production, il va falloir utiliser un vrai service discovery comme etcd, j'ai oublié le D là, Consul ou Zookeeper. Donc, je ne sais pas si vous êtes un petit peu familier avec le principe du service discovery, mais ça va agir un petit peu comme un store. En général, c'est des key value stores, donc des stores très simples, qui vont permettre de conserver des éléments, notamment de configuration. C'est-à-dire que le serveur MySQL, au lieu de l'avoir en dur au niveau de l'IP, on va l'avoir dans le service discovery. On a besoin d'un swarm master, donc qui va avoir le démon Docker et puis le démon Docker Swarm aussi, et puis également la même chose sur les autres serveurs. Et en fait, ce que va faire le Swarm Master, c'est qu'il va faire un heartbeat, un battement de cœur sur les différents nodes pour voir s'ils sont toujours là, s'ils sont toujours en bonne santé, etc. Donc ça c'est géré automatiquement par les différents composants de Swarm. Et donc après, on utilise la ligne de commande classiquement. Comme je disais, c'est juste une variable d'environnement. Et puis il y a une modification du port. Mais globalement, c'est le même fonctionnement. Donc l'installation la plus simple, c'est avec Docker Machine. Docker Machine, ça permet de provisionner des VM auprès des différents fournisseurs de cloud, AWS, DigitalOcean, Azure, etc. Et donc en fait, on a une commande qui est toujours un petit peu longue. Mais bon, voilà, la première commande, peu importe, là j'ai juste lancé mes serveurs sur DigitalOcean, mais ça c'est pas la question. Là, il y a quelque chose qui est assez intéressant, qui est le label. Je reviendrai un petit peu plus tard, c'est ce qui nous permet de travailler sur des contraintes. Et puis bon, là c'est juste pour indiquer qu'on veut lancer un Docker en version Swarm avec un Swarm Master. Et puis le service Discovery, donc qui pourrait être le token, d'ailleurs j'ai fait un mélange des deux, mais qui normalement, en fait, là, si c'est Consul, c'est Consul, c'est ce que je voulais mettre. Et là, on a des options aussi de Consul, et je reviendrai, ça c'est pour les réseaux. Donc en gros, ces deux lignes-là sont pas obligatoires, et là on peut juste utiliser le token qui est la version la plus simple. Et donc ça c'est pour le master, et ensuite on a ça pour les différents nœuds. Et puis ensuite, simplement, on peut utiliser l'eval de Docker Machine env, et ça va mettre à jour automatiquement les variables d'environnement. C'est très pratique. Et donc du coup, on se retrouve si on fait un Docker PS avec les mêmes infos, mais on a quelques infos en plus. Donc là, j'avais démarré 2 nœuds. Et donc en plus des infos classiques sur les différents containers qui sont lancés, on a d'abord le nom qui est préfixé, le nom du container. Là on aurait juste BBVis, et là on a le serveur sur lequel il a été déployé qui vient le préfixer, et puis on a les informations qui sont propres à Swarm concernant le nombre de nœuds et leur santé. Donc je parlais des labels. En fait, on va utiliser les labels pour différencier les caractéristiques physiques des serveurs. Parce que si vous avez une architecture, par définition, si vous êtes en cluster, c'est que vous avez une architecture un petit peu complexe. On peut imaginer que vous allez avoir, par exemple, votre application web, et puis à côté, vous avez votre base de données. Et dans une logique classique de Docker, on ne met pas plus d'un processus par container, donc forcément on va avoir 2 containers différents, mais on a envie qu'ils vivent à côté, quoi. On n'a pas envie qu'il y en ait un qui se retrouve dans le data center de New York et l'autre à Amsterdam, parce qu'on va se taper la latence réseau à chaque commande. Donc on va définir en fait des contraintes qui étaient celles que j'avais mis précédemment au moment où on a provisionné la machine. C'est-à-dire qu'en fait, on dit au démon Docker que cette machine-là, elle est labellisée avec un label qui est complètement libre. On peut mettre ce qu'on veut. Donc là, moi, j'ai utilisé région, enfin, on pourrait faire vraiment ce qu'on veut. Et on dit que ça, c'est les régions Europe. Et ici, par contre, on l'a lancé à DigitalOcean à New York 3. Et donc, du coup, en label, j'ai mis America. Du coup, ça va permettre au moment où je lance un Docker Run, ça va permettre de pouvoir, c'est la slide suivante, ça va permettre de préciser cette contrainte. Voilà, j'avais lancé le 3e, il était en Asie au data center de Singapour, et donc du coup je rajoute cette contrainte, et donc le Docker Swarm, il va regarder parmi les différents serveurs qui ont ce label-là, et il va prendre en compte que cela. Donc s'il y en a un, il y en aura un seul, mais s'il y en a plusieurs, après il va refaire sa stratégie de placement, quoi. Donc ça c'est quelque chose qui va vous permettre, c'est très utile pour les emplacements géographiques, ça peut être aussi utile en fonction des caractéristiques des serveurs. Typiquement, vous avez des serveurs SSD dans votre cluster, certaines applications qui ont besoin d'une certaine vitesse d'écriture, vous allez les mettre sur ces serveurs-là, ou dans le sens inverse, vous avez des bases de données qui sont avec des volumétries très importantes, et donc vous préférez avoir ça sur un disque mécanique, quoi. Donc ça vous permet de gérer ces questions-là. Et on a quand même tout ça c'est très beau sur le papier, mais dans la pratique, on a quand même différents problèmes en fait à prendre en compte. Si on se rappelle des objectifs initiaux, répartition de charge, disponibilité, etc., quoi. La première chose, c'est que dans un Docker monoserveur, on a juste un Nginx qui va faire un reverse proxy sur l'application web, si c'est une application web, sinon elle peut être accessible directement avec le port qui a été mappé, et ça fonctionne très bien comme ça. Là, du coup, on va devoir faire un load balancer qui va pouvoir répartir la charge, quoi. C'est pas non plus un gros changement. On peut le faire avec HAProxy, mais bon, si on a déjà un Nginx d'installer, on peut aussi très bien le faire avec Nginx. Mais donc là, ce qu'on a fait, c'est qu'on est un petit peu obligé dans la conf en dur de mettre les IP là, de mes 3 nodes, et ensuite on utilise classiquement le proxy pass, mais sauf qu'on lui dit que c'est BBVise, et donc derrière, lui, Nginx va faire le load balancing entre ces trois serveurs. Donc c'est vrai que ça fonctionne très bien, mais on a quand même introduit quelque part des IP en dur, ce qui n'est pas forcément terrible. Si on veut aller plus loin, à ce moment-là, il faut mieux passer aussi par un service discovery. Donc si on en a déjà déployé un pour Swarm, ça tombe bien. Donc par exemple, Consul ne fait pas ce n'est pas que un store de clés valeurs, c'est aussi un serveur DNS. Et donc en fait, là, au lieu d'avoir à faire gérer ça par Nginx, on pourrait tout simplement renvoyer vers un DNS en spécifiant l'adresse de Consul comme serveur DNS. Et donc du coup, Consul, il est au courant de toutes les machines qui sont leur état, leur santé, et il met à jour en fonction. Et donc c'est lui qui va, en fait, si on fait une répartition de charge, au lieu que ce soit une répartition de charge classique, c'est une répartition de charge par DNS, en fait. En faisant bouger les DNS, ça a d'autres avantages, c'est que vous pouvez préfixer plus ou moins avec une précision plus ou moins forte au niveau de votre application. Donc ça peut être mysql.com, et puis vous dans votre serveur DNS, ce sera l'ensemble des containers qui ont MySQL, et puis après vous pouvez les préfixer en fonction de la zone ou en fonction d'autres critères. Je ne sais pas pourquoi j'ai pris MySQL comme exemple. Bref. Donc voilà un petit peu certaines difficultés. Donc voilà, donc là c'était un petit peu le principe général de Swarm quand on est dans un environnement de production. Donc on retrouve la ligne de commande, on retrouve Swarm qui agit en tant que proxy. Mais en fait, pour que lui il soit hautement disponible, il va y avoir plusieurs masters. Je parlais d'un Swarm master. En fait, si on veut que voilà, ça devient l'élément clé, ça devient le Swarm master, parce que s'il tombe, bah, l'ensemble du cluster tombe. Enfin, en tout cas, n'est plus accessible. Et donc, du coup, ce qu'on fait, c'est qu'on lance en général entre 3 ou 5 Swarm master. Et donc, ils vont utiliser le service Discovery pour faire le master election, c'est-à-dire pour savoir entre eux qui est le master. Et s'il y en a un qui tombe et qui était master, les deux autres, avec un protocole de gossip, sont capables de s'en rendre compte et d'élire un nouveau master. Et si lui revient, bah, ils vont de nouveau parler et voir qui va être master. Donc ça, c'est possible grâce au service Discovery, donc etcd ou Consul. Et donc c'est basé sur des algorithmes qui à la base c'était Paxos et maintenant c'était une version un petit peu complexe, et donc là maintenant c'est essentiellement basé sur l'algorithme Raft qui permet de faire l'élection. Donc un point intéressant, c'est la question de l'ordonnancement en fait, parce que quand vous dites, quand on utilise Swarm, c'est essentiellement pour pouvoir lancer des Docker dans votre cluster. Et la question, c'est de savoir comment est-ce que Swarm va décider pourquoi est-ce qu'il va le décider de lancer ce container dans ce host, dans ce node, et pas dans l'autre. Donc en fait, il y a plusieurs stratégies. Il y a une stratégie qui est la stratégie par défaut, qui est spread, et c'est en fonction du nombre de containers qui sont déjà sur chaque serveur. Donc finalement, on va chercher le serveur qui potentiellement aurait le moins de charge, parce que c'est une manière de répartir la charge, c'est assez logique. C'est l'option par défaut, mais on peut au contraire avoir une stratégie qui est complètement l'inverse, qui est de dire on va essayer d'exploiter au maximum les ressources puisqu'on les paye autant. Donc là du coup on va plutôt, et puis en fonction aussi bien sûr des éléments qui sont déjà présents pour éviter de la redondance, quoi. Donc c'est quelque chose qui va favoriser le regroupement. Donc c'est le bin pack, et puis après la dernière option qui est random. Et enfin, on peut, mais c'est un petit peu plus complexe comme architecture, mais on peut brancher ça sur un cluster Mesos. Donc si vous avez, je sais pas moi, une équipe de R&D qui a déjà un cluster Mesos pour lancer du Hadoop, etc., bah, vous pouvez réutiliser votre cluster Mesos dans le cadre de Swarm. Maintenant, mon petit avis, c'est que si vous avez déjà un cluster Mesos, vous avez aussi des outils propres à Mesos comme un Marathon qui vous permettent de faire à peu près la même chose que Swarm. Donc je pense que c'est un peu un monde à part, et vous n'avez peut-être pas spécialement besoin de Swarm. Enfin, bon, bref. Ça, c'est mon avis. Donc là, c'était la to-do. Quand j'avais fait un peu le point avec eux, il y a pas mal de choses qu'ils ont faites. C'est-à-dire que là, il y a eu la version 1.0 qui a été publiée lors de la DockerCon Europe, donc en décembre dernier. Et donc ça a été testé jusqu'à 1000 nœuds et 30 000 containers, et le placement des Docker Run continue à se faire en quelques millisecondes, donc a priori ça tient plutôt bien la charge. Les algorithmes de l'ordonnanceur, j'ai mis fait partiellement parce que potentiellement pour en avoir plus, Mesos en a plus. Et le réordonnancement, ça c'est un sujet assez complexe qui maintenant est par défaut depuis la version de Docker 1.11 qui est sortie là il y a quelques jours. C'est quelque chose d'assez complexe en fait, le réordonnancement. Vous avez un container qui a été lancé dans l'un de vos nœuds, et ce nœud-là tombe. Bon. Qu'est-ce que vous faites, qu'est-ce que va décider le Swarm Master par rapport aux containers qui ont été lancés? Est-ce qu'il décide par lui-même que du coup le container il est là, et s'il avait été lancé, c'est qu'il a une utilité, donc je le remets quelque part sur un autre nœud? Si je le remets sur un autre nœud et que le nœud qui était tombé revient, est-ce que je le replace sur le nœud initial, parce qu'il y avait peut-être une raison qu'il soit dans ce nœud initial-là. Donc finalement, c'est quelque chose qui a l'air d'être assez simple comme idée. On se dit, voilà, le container il est tombé, on cherche le prochain nœud disponible et met-le dedans. Et en fait, finalement, c'est un petit peu plus complexe comme question. Je m'étais un petit peu frotté, et finalement, quand on rentre dans le détail, c'est pas si simple. Il y a un dernier point où j'ai pas fait de slide, mais qui est un point toujours très important, enfin un petit peu complexe quand on est dans le monde Docker, c'est que on est vraiment à la base dans cette idée que voilà, les containers ils sont stateless et quand on a vraiment des containers stateless comme c'était le cas de ma petite application, c'est super, ça fonctionne très très bien. Mais à partir du moment où on a quand même des données de la persistance, voilà, il faut une base de données, il faut partager des fichiers, enfin, ce genre de choses-là. Ce qui est vrai en monoserveur, on peut s'en tirer assez facilement en montant un volume, en attachant le volume, et du coup il peut être partagé, il n'a pas à être dans le container, enfin tout ça c'est très vu. Mais c'est encore plus vrai quand on est dans un mode cluster, parce que là vous pouviez partager, je sais pas moi, des fichiers utilisateurs qui ont été téléchargés, vous avez monté un volume, et puis comme ça, voilà, c'est quelque chose qui reste même si le container il meurt, etc. Si vous avez une logique de haute disponibilité, ces fichiers-là ils doivent être potentiellement disponibles sur chacun des nœuds où vos containers sont déployés, et ils doivent être synchronisés. Donc derrière, ça veut souvent dire soit que vous allez utiliser un service tiers comme S3 ou peu importe si vous pouvez, soit que vous allez mettre en place un système de fichiers distribués de type GlusterFS ou Ceph. Donc ça rajoute encore quand même un élément dans l'architecture. Et pour les bases de données, c'est encore plus complexe, parce que vous ne pouvez pas simplement vous contenter de partager le varlib PostgreSQL, de le monter sur un système de fichiers distribués, de lancer les containers Postgre comme ça, parce que là, avec les locks, vous êtes mal parti. Donc du coup, ça veut dire réplication, ça veut dire potentiellement sharding, enfin voilà. Et ça, c'est quelque chose qui est aussi un petit peu complexe. Donc voilà, il y a des points, notamment sur la question de la persistance, qui sont pas encore complètement résolus. Tous ces projets-là sont quand même assez jeunes, hein. Là, je parlais de la version 1.0 qui a été sortie en décembre 2015. Kubernetes de Google, c'est pareil, ils ont... Je crois que la première version stable est sortie en juin ou en juillet dernier, donc c'est des projets qui n'ont même pas un an si on prend la dernière version stable. Donc voilà, donc il y a encore du travail, mais c'est un domaine vraiment de mon point de vue, vraiment très intéressant. Voilà, donc je ne sais pas si vous avez des questions. Je t'avoue que je connais un peu moins les solutions de CoreOS. De l'image que j'en ai, Fleet n'a pas une approche, ça n'a pas une approche aussi intégrée des différentes solutions en tout cas qui existent. C'est Swarm qui est la plus intégrée, qui est la plus naturelle en fait. Si on utilise déjà Docker sur des serveurs comme ça, mais de façon individuelle, c'est assez simple de passer à Swarm. Mais je t'avoue que je ne pourrais pas répondre précisément sur la comparaison avec Fleet, que je ne connais pas très bien en fait. Oui. Alors, la réplication, elle va être gérée, via Docker Compose. En fait, avec la nouvelle version de Docker Compose, quand on l'utilise avec Swarm, mais en particulier si on met en place un réseau, un network overlay entre les différents nœuds, à ce moment-là, les répliques qui existaient depuis très longtemps dans Docker Compose, qui permettaient de lancer plusieurs containers à l'intérieur d'un monoserveur, là, ça va être fait au niveau du cluster. Donc du coup, ça va être le dernier élément de la galaxie Docker, ça va être Compose qui va agir à ce niveau-là. Donc c'est vrai que si on reprend chacun des éléments, effectivement, on retrouve un peu les mêmes problématiques, hein, parce que toutes les solutions font face au même problème, quoi. Donc la réponse est via Docker Compose, quoi.
On n'entend pas encore de questions.
Au niveau du déploiement d'un cluster Swarm, est-ce qu'il y a déjà des solutions avec Chef ou avec Puppet pour pouvoir le déployer, avoir un code et une sorte de version écrite du cluster quelque part, ou ça reste encore assez manuel en utilisant Docker Machine
Non, il y a des solutions. Enfin, moi, j'ai plutôt utilisé Ansible, quand même plus du monde Python. Mais voilà, je sais que sur Ansible, il y a des choses. Ça m'étonnerait qu'il n'y ait pas quelque chose qui ait été fait pour Chef et Puppet. Et puisque d'une façon générale, ils essaient quand même de se rattacher le plus possible au train des containers pour pas le louper. Je pense que voilà, ils doivent être bien présents. Mais je n'ai pas connaissance précisément n'utilisant pas trop ni Chef ni Puppet. Mais en cible, on a en tout cas. Ça reste assez simple, hein. Au niveau du déploiement, ça reste quelque chose d'assez simple, parce que là, le Docker Machine, le simplifie un petit peu, mais au final, ça reste des démons qui sont lancés avec juste des options pour. Au début, c'est toujours la difficulté en fait quand on est dans une logique de cluster, c'est qu'il y a un bootstrap en fait. Les 3 premiers serveurs, si on lance un swarm avec 3 masters, ça il y a un petit peu de truc manuel parce qu'il faut pouvoir indiquer les IP de chacun. À partir du moment où ça s'est lancé, le reste est assez simple, quoi.
Du coup, j'ai 2 questions. La première, c'est si on a déjà des serveurs des conteneurs qui sont déjà en place, est-ce que si on met un Swarm Master, comment on fait pour le mettre, par exemple, si j'ai 10 conteneurs déjà d'actifs, pour le rattacher au Swarm Master? Est-ce que c'est possible et comment?
Ouais, c'est possible en fait à partir du moment où le host devient un swarm client, enfin devient un swarm agent. À partir de ce moment-là, le Swarm Master, quand on va l'utiliser quand on va taper dessus, il va récupérer toutes les infos. Si vous faites un Docker PS et que vous avez rattaché un serveur qui préexistait et que vous avez installé l'agent Swarm dessus, le Docker PS va vous montrer tous les containers qui sont déjà lancés et on va pouvoir le réutiliser à ce niveau-là, quoi.
Donc dans ce serveur Swarm Master, on aura tous les nœuds, dont celui-ci qui est déjà va être ajouté. Okay.
C'est ça. En fait, c'est vraiment c'est pour ça que quand on voit les différents logos, c'est vraiment la logique un peu d'un proxy. C'est-à-dire qu'en fait, bien sûr, il y a de l'intelligence sur la question notamment du placement. Là, il y a de l'intelligence, mais par contre, quand c'est un PS, il se contente juste d'aller fetcher les différentes API. Donc là, on est vraiment dans une logique proxy. Il y a zéro intelligence, quoi. Il fetch les Docker PS de chacun des serveurs, il les agrège. Et voilà, après c'est juste comme je le montrais tout à l'heure, il va préfixer le nom des containers avec le nom du host parce que potentiellement on pourrait avoir des containers d'un nom similaire sur différents donc des conflits, donc c'est pour éviter les conflits. C'est pareil sur l'ID, il y a un ID qui est rajouté, qui est l'ID au niveau du container, au niveau du cluster. Mais mis à part ces questions d'identification qui sont pas des vrais problèmes en soi, ça vit très bien et on peut d'ailleurs continuer, ça n'a pas trop de sens, mais on peut très bien continuer à les taper directement si on veut sur l'API du Docker en direct, du nœud en question. Donc c'est pour ça que je trouve que c'est une approche la plus simple en fait par rapport au passage d'un Docker monoserveur à un Vision Cluster, quoi. Bon, après je discutais l'autre jour avec les gens de Kubernetes et ils n'étaient pas trop d'accord avec moi, mais bon, c'est normal, quoi.
Du coup, j'ai juste une autre question par rapport à Ansible, à Chef et à Puppet. C'est dans quelle mesure la compatibilité est faite? Est-ce que tu as un exemple concret, simple? Tu pourrais nous expliquer de l'utilisation de Puppet ou de Ansible avec...
Moi, de mon côté, c'est pour ça que je disais qu'ils essaient de rattraper le train. C'est que quelque part, dans un environnement qui est que Docker, une bonne partie de ce qui était déployé par Ansible ou par Puppet va rentrer dans les Dockerfiles en fait. Ouais. Et donc du coup, un projet comme Ansible, ce qu'il va faire, c'est simplement déployer le host en fait. Mais le host, c'est une coquille vide. À la rigueur, il va avoir un Nginx dessus, il va peut-être y avoir un cron. Mais ça va être un peu finalement une coquille vide qui va juste avoir un démon Docker, quoi. Donc ça ne veut pas dire que c'est pas utile parce que c'est quand même très bien de pouvoir déployer de façon fixe et parallèle sur 50 serveurs en même temps. Mais on va avoir beaucoup moins de choses à gérer que par le passé parce que quand même la plupart de l'applicatif est côté container, donc du coup dans le Dockerfile, quoi.
Ok, ouais, parce que moi j'avais l'idée qu'un conteneur c'était quelque chose de jetable en fait.
Ouais.
Et donc si on avait besoin d'une nouvelle configuration, on mettait à jour le Dockerfile et on n'avait pas besoin de faire une gestion de configuration, quoi.
Oui, parce qu'en fait, les Dockerfiles, ils sont, en fait, c'est par couche, en fait. C'est par couche, et toutes les couches inférieures sont read-only, en fait. Il n'y a que quand on fait un Docker run que on a une couche qui est accessible en écriture. Donc, en fait, toutes les sous-couches, quelque part, sont stables. Et donc, en fait, elles sont en cache. La première fois, il va builder l'ensemble du processus. Donc, je ne sais pas si on a une application, je sais pas, par exemple en Python, on a une application qui va utiliser du NLTK, du NumPy, du SciPy, du scikit-learn, enfin voilà, les choses classiques en data science en Python. Toutes ces choses-là, on va pouvoir les mettre dans des images intermédiaires parce que c'est finalement des choses qu'on va avoir besoin de façon récurrente, et on se garde juste une dernière image avec le code applicatif. Et donc, quand on va reconstruire parce qu'on a fait une mise à jour, le build il va se faire de façon quasi instantanée parce que toutes les couches précédentes sont restées dans l'ancienne version. Donc c'est pour ça que quand on construit les Dockerfiles, il faut vraiment essayer d'aller du bas vers le haut, quoi, et vraiment garder la partie qui va beaucoup bouger, c'est-à-dire la partie sur laquelle on développe, tout en haut de la pile, quoi.
Okay. Merci.
Pas d'autres questions?
Juste une question. En fait, comment est gérée la résilience là-dedans? Est-ce qu'en cas de crash d'un Docker Swarm, la reprise sur incident elle se fait sans casse, ou c'est-à-dire il retrouve ses bébés, est-ce qu'il les redémarre automatiquement ou il faut une intervention manuelle?
Alors ça dépend comment on l'a déployé. Si on l'a déployé en version un peu test avec un seul Swarm Master, le Swarm Master il est hébergé sur un host comme tous les autres. Si ce serveur-là il tombe, c'est fini, quoi. Enfin, le cluster il n'existe plus, quoi. Mais ça c'est censé être le mode test, hein. En production, on ne fait pas comme ça. Et donc, ce que je disais tout à l'heure, on déploie en général 3 ou 5, parce que c'est les chiffres pour faire le consensus, 3 ou 5 masters qui se parlent entre eux avec un système de heartbeat, avec un consensus, hein, l'algorithme dont je parlais tout à l'heure, Raft, qui permet de faire le consensus. Donc, si un serveur qui est master tombe, c'est un autre serveur master qui devient master à sa place de façon automatique, et ça c'est géré sans aucune intervention, quoi. Donc à ce niveau-là, ça se passe bien. En tout cas, c'est prévu pour, quoi. Donc, ok. Bon, je crois que c'est... Merci.
Merci, Francis.
Good. No intros. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. My name is Diogo Monica. I'm the security lead at Docker. Super cool to be in Paris. I do some of these meetups, and it's always interesting to see different cities. In particular, I think it was really interesting for me to understand every 5 words of Docker Swarm, and then something else, and then Docker Swarm, and then orchestration, and then all of these things. It's kind of cool. My French is it's not as good as it used to be. I think the only thing that I can say is je ne parle pas français, which is obviously very useful here in France. Perfect. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about security. I was invited to talk about security, and in particular I would like to focus on what we've been doing in the past 6 months. So I joined Docker about a year and 2 months ago, and I joined Docker on Docker 1.5 around that time. And since then, since Docker 1.6, we've been really focusing a ton on putting a lot of security features into the platform itself. One of our fundamental beliefs is that you cannot bolt this on later on. It has to come from the core. It has to come from the engine. It has to come from everything that we do. So today I'm going to go over a little bit of a brief overview of the first 3 slides of how we do segmentation. I'm not sure what the crowd is in terms of knowledge about Docker and about how the engine works. It's going to be a high-level overview. Then I'm going to jump into some concrete examples of things that I'm really proud that we've done and that actually push forward with the container ecosystem security, and I think are really exciting for you to see. Then at the end, I'm going to do some demos. So it should be cool. As I mentioned, Docker, the way that I see this is Docker should always be used when you're using applications. The reality is that containers add an additional layer of security in whatever you're doing. So the usual comparison between containers and VMs, the way that I see it is you should always use containers and you should sometimes use VMs. Why? Because when you use a container system, in particular when you're using Docker, you're not adding a lot more of surface of exposure, but we are getting a lot more isolation and a lot more security of our applications. And so I'm going to show a few use cases and how we added some features to Docker 110 and 111. And then I'm going to go through a few demos, and I'm going to leave a ton of questions, a ton of time for you to ask me questions at the end. Perfect. So Docker security. What is actually happening under the hood? People don't seem to get enough of throwing this in our faces, but people keep saying Docker has not invented containers. And this is absolutely true. Docker is built on the shoulders of giants. And we say giants because people have been working on the Linux kernel for 20 years. And we are actually built on top, and containerization in general is built on top of some core features that have been added to the Linux kernel for the past 25 years of existence. In particular, three things that were the base component of what we actually call a modern container, which are namespaces, C groups, and capabilities. And I'm going to go over each of them in a little more detail. So under the hood, Docker uses namespaces. What are namespaces? Well, back in the day, 20 years ago, Linux systems weren't really made to be multi-tenant. If you are in a system, and right now, if you are in a system, in a Linux system, and do PS to see all the processes, you're actually seeing the process of the whole machine. So people started deciding, oh, wait, we actually should have the ability on the kernel of separating these kinds of views. And the PID namespace is what actually separates the processes, but there's other namespaces, such as network, the network traffic that they're using, or mount, so the actual file system that they're using, and so on and so forth. So with under the hood, with namespaces, for example, you can have a Docker container where you actually run PS, and the only thing you see is your own processes. And this makes sense, right? Because namespaces are making sure that this process can only see its own version of the state of the kernel. So it's as simple as this. It's the ability of adding multi-tenancy views onto the kernel. And this is one of the base features that containers were built on. The second base feature was capabilities. So in C groups, capabilities I'm going to talk about next, but C groups are incredibly important for isolation of resources. Kernel is shared across all applications. If you're running one application and there's a fork bomb, I can guarantee you the whole system will feel it, and the whole system will probably crash. C groups came with the promise of isolation of resources. And what resources are we talking about? We're talking about the obvious resources. We're talking about CPU, we're talking about memory, we're talking about disk I/O, etc., so on and so forth. So if you look at a system and you are running two processes, you want to make sure that you have the capability of saying this process cannot starve this other process. And so you want to allocate a certain portion of CPU, certain portion of memory. This is what C groups do. So namespaces gives you a view of the system operating, and C groups gives you the ability of isolating and segregating exactly the amount of resources that each process can use. In particular, for us, each container can use. And finally, the final base capability that containers really used for isolation and segmentation was capabilities. Capabilities essentially go against the old model where root is essentially God in the system and it can do everything. What the Linux kernel maintainers started realizing is we can't have this UID 0 thing that just does everything and everybody can have UID 0 whenever they want. So what they started doing is, okay, this root privilege is going to be segregated into multiple capabilities, into 70-something capabilities. And they started adding these distinguished capabilities, and you can now actually add some powers of root, but not other powers of root. So that's essentially what this is. As an example, and I'm going to demo it later, we can actually run a Docker container and drop the shown capability. And then inside of the container, you just won't be able to do shown while being root. And I'll demo that later. So these are the three big things that containers were built upon. But in the past two versions of Docker, we've actually been shipping a lot more. And not only have we been shipping more, we want these things to be on by default. So for the example of capabilities, it's pretty interesting to note that right now, Docker containers actually have less than half of the capabilities that Linux has to offer by default. So by just the virtue of running a Docker container, your application has less than half of the capabilities that the Linux system has. What this means is that by simply running your application inside of a Docker container, you're already gaining a lot of isolation for free by default. Obviously, you also have namespaces, which means that the process in the container can see other people's processes, and they can influence other people's resources because of C groups. So this is shaping up to be really good. In Docker 110, we shipped something that was incredibly important to us and the community really wanted, which was user namespaces. So remember when I said the namespaces provide you your isolated view of what is running in the kernel and what's running in the system? Well, user namespaces do the exact same thing, but for the actual group IDs and user IDs inside of the container. So the fact that you're running a Docker container does not mean that you have to ignore the 25 years of best practices of Linux administration, right? But everybody does, because everybody runs their Docker containers as root. By the way, you shouldn't. You should always use user and run as a non-privileged user. But the realization for us is that, yes, we can essentially blame every developer in the world for doing the wrong thing out of the box and for building their containers with root, but we should just recognize that they're doing it and now work towards something that can actually protect them. And this user namespace is essentially the solution for that. What we did here is we added support for Docker for user namespaces, which allows us essentially to have root inside of the container, UID 0 inside of the container is no longer UID 0 outside of the container. So they're essentially completely segmented. Even if there's an escape, even if there's a malicious application here that is able to escape our containment features, our namespaces, our C groups, etc., they come to the host as a normal user, possibly nobody with no privileges at all, which means that they still have to escalate privileges on the system itself. Gaining root inside of the container no longer means gaining root anywhere else. You obviously still have the capabilities, but they don't even have those capabilities anymore because they are not root, absolutely not whatsoever. The best description that I have of this is actually from Michael Karish. He said that most notably, for user namespaces, a process can have a non-zero user ID outside the namespace, while actually at the same time having a user ID inside of the namespace. In other words, the process is unprivileged for operations outside of the namespace, but has root inside of the namespace. The reason why this matters is you can actually bind to port 80 inside of your own namespace. You can actually do root operations. Before, if you wanted port 80, since it's less than 1024, you needed root. You needed a capability net raw. But now you are root, but not really. So this is an incredibly powerful feature and makes people running as root not as bad, because we can all of a sudden from the Docker daemon configure and say, no, even if you run as root, your root is not real root. So that's really powerful. Another thing that we added on Docker 110 that I'm really excited about was authorization plugins. So as you know, Docker from the start started directly as the concept of a daemon. The person that has access to the daemon essentially has access to control the system, right? Even if you think about it, like there's the operation which is running a privileged container. What a privileged container really means is that the person that has access to Docker daemon is effectively root. Why? Because if you're privileged, by definition, you have access to the memory of the system and have access to the whole file system. And if you have access to the whole file system, you are effectively root. However, people wanted starting to do multi-tenancy, not just at the host and daemon level, but inside of the daemon. They wanted multiple users to actually operate on the same daemon and not be able to essentially mess with each other. What that means is that if there's user A that runs a container and there's user B that runs another container, you don't want user B to be able to get root on the machine or kill users A processes and maybe not even see each other's processes and each other's containers, right? So we have namespacing and isolation on the Linux kernel, but the Docker daemon itself did not provide you that. And so we added this feature, which allows you essentially to, on the daemon, you write a plugin that you connect, and this plugin essentially sees every single call to the Docker API and gets to reject or accept. Further than that, you can actually parse out the results of the remote call. So for example, if somebody does a Docker PS and it's user Diogo, then I can only list the things that Diogo has access to and only the containers that Diogo sees. And this gets to actually be really powerful, because if you want to mitigate people from using privileged or from mounting volumes or from doing whatever, you can always do it with this, because the application and the authorization plugin will always see everything, and it will always have the capability of rejecting or allowing something to go through. Another thing that is incredibly important for the security of our containers is seccomp. Seccomp stands for secure computation. And it essentially is a way to tell the kernel which system calls of Linux I allow to go through or which system calls I don't. Think of this as the lowest level filter that you can have on a Unix system. There's really nothing else lower level than system calls from the point of view of your application, right? You're developing an application for a Unix system. The lowest level that you can have are these system calls. Open, write, bind, system calls that you actually are doing to create an operation, to create a socket, to interact with the network. These are the lowest level. Seccomp allows you to, since Docker 110, tell exactly the container in Docker daemon which system calls are allowed and which system calls are denied. Why is this cool? Well, this is cool because it allows you to do tons of things. Number one, it allows you to mitigate the surface of exposure of the kernel. One of the things that containers are different from virtual machines is the fact that containers share the same kernel, right? They are essentially shared surface, which means that you want to reduce that surface as much as possible. because you don't want to have a malicious container or a malicious application that gets popped try to attack your own kernel. And you can do it with this. Not only you can do it with this, by default, Docker is shipping with a whitelist of syscalls. We block 54 right now, 54 different syscalls that are dangerous and that we believe should not be allowed. And you can actually fine-tune that and block further. You can inspect what your application actually needs and block all the syscalls except those system calls that you really want. Is this useful? Well, this CVE was the keyctl privilege escalation 3 months back on Linux. Did not work on Docker. Why didn't it work on Docker? It's a kernel exploit, so it should have worked on Docker. We don't allow the syscall. So these whitelists are actually really powerful and allow us to have a secure default shipping with Docker. So for us, it's really not just about shipping the feature. Oh yeah, we have seccomp support. That doesn't matter to us. What matters to us is the moment you install Docker 1.11 and the moment you do Docker 1 with your application inherits these things and these whitelists by default. On another subject that I'm really passionate about, I've been working on distributed trust and provenance of container images for a while. And we've built something called Notary. Notary was released as an experimental feature in Docker 1.8. And in Docker 1.11, we actually integrated hardware keys for you to store your keys in actual hardware. Not only that, you can actually generate the keys in hardware itself. What I'm telling you is that your key never actually hits disk, never hits the memory of your computer. So it can't be stolen. So you can have a key that you've never seen that can't be stolen to operate on your container images. Notary is what Docker Content Trust uses. And Docker Content Trust is the ability to essentially sign containers and run signed containers. And so we've delivered a really, really powerful way to both have keys in hardware and allow key delegations. Imagine the normal model where you do signing, right? You have a GPG key. It has a private public key component. You distribute the public key component, and then you sign with your private key. What happens if you want to give another team the access to sign a package? You essentially give them your private key, right? What if you want to give them the access to only sign their team's packages? You're screwed. You have a GPG key. The GPG key signs their packages. You don't have a choice. Either they send the packages to you and you sign it, or they don't have a choice for doing it independently. So this model is inherently broken, and this is something that in the current package managers, most all of them get it wrong. And we essentially built it right. We used something called the update framework, which was done by a bunch of researchers in 2009. They wrote a bunch of papers on it. And essentially what comes out of it is a very strong model where you can create the concept of roles, and you can create a concept of key delegations, which means that my company creates a root key, and then I can give a key to team A and a key to team B, and they can do their signing independently from each other without us ever sharing private keys on the wire. Not only that, it allows us to have transparent key rotation, which means if a key gets lost or if a key gets compromised, you can actually rotate it transparently without restarting the whole root of trust like you would with a GPG key. And by default, it comes integrated in hardware. So you really have an end-to-end signing system that comes from security from hardware. The cool portion of this, you actually have to touch these things to sign. So malware on your laptop can't do the signing operation by itself. This actually has an induction contact. It's called YubiKey Neo 4s. You have to touch it for the signing operation to actually occur. So this is actually a pretty cool security feature that we added that really nobody else has. And then PID control. PID control is one of the features that we just added. So for the longest time, it was a little bit embarrassing because Docker depends on the kernel for the majority of these features, as I've told you, right? Docker did not invent containers. We added a lot of stuff to it, but we're ultimately depending on the Linux kernel for a lot of our features. And the Linux kernel for a long time did not have the ability of controlling processes at the C groups level, which meant that you had a container, but that container could actually run mostly illimited processes and kill your machine because it's a fork bomb. If it's a fork bomb and all your resources are hogs and you don't have a good way of limiting the number of PIDs, it will occupy all the memory, it will occupy all the CPU, and things will die. And so finally, Docker can actually withstand, as of Docker 1.11, the fork bomb attack. And it's actually pretty cool because for demos, it's pretty neat to show that you can do a fork bomb inside of a container and actually survive. And I'm going to try to do that live, and that's going to go wrong because we know that all demos are going to go wrong. So it's going to be incredibly embarrassing. But hey, let's hope the demo gods are with us. Other features that we've added was we know that it's really hard to see all these knobs and features that you actually have and configure them. So with collaboration with CIS, we created a benchmark for you to read. There's like I think it's 100 pages, but it's a 100 pages benchmark that says exactly how you should configure your Docker installation. But having a PDF in your hand is useless. So we actually built something automated called Docker Bench that you can run to, and I'm going to demo that. You can run on a Docker installation. It essentially tells you everything that you're doing right or doing wrong with red, green, or blue, and tells you, oh, by the way, you should care about this or you should reconfigure that. And this is tied to the actual CIS benchmark that gives you the best practices of security configuration. And finally, this is actually really cool. It came out yesterday. It came out yesterday. Are you familiar with the NCC group? The NCC group is essentially a very large consulting group in the United States and internationally, really, that did the TrueCrypt audit, for example. They have Tom Ritter, they have a bunch of really good cryptographers. Anyway, what matters is that they get a lot of questions about security for Docker from their customers. So they decided to do a report. It's a report, 110 pages, about containment, isolation, and security. And then at the end, they actually have some pretty awesome conclusions, including this table. And this table is a comparison between the container runtimes of Docker, of Rocket, and of LXC. And I think it's pretty obvious what is actually happening here. And as of Docker 1.11, these are the features that actually matter, and these are the isolation that you actually get. From a container runtime perspective, usually when people say, oh, Docker is more insecure than X, Y, or Z, it's a marketing stunt. If you go to the actual details, you should look at these tables, and you should actually evaluate by yourself what is actually happening. So this is homework for you. Perfect. So now I think I would like to go directly to demos and then questions at the end that I think will be better. Okay? Okay, demos. It's going to be a little bit awkward because I'm holding the microphone and trying to demo. Let me clear this thing. So I have this. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to demo a fork bomb. So PID namespace is on Docker 1.11. I'm running Docker 1.11. Oh my God, it's going to be so hard to type. No, it's going to be awkward for them. So Docker 1.11, I'm running Docker 1.11. How am I running Docker 1.11? I'm actually running Docker for Mac. I don't know if you've used it, but there's a beta out. It's essentially application, you install it, very easy. It essentially gives you a little virtual machine, which is xHive. You don't have to deal with VirtualBox, which is amazing. And essentially we install it and it runs. It's pretty fast and it's just there. So it made my development a lot easier. So I recommend that you sign up for the beta and try it out. Anyway, Docker 1.11 running here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an Ubuntu container. And this is just a bash command, right? But I'm going to add one thing. I'm going to add PID's limit. I'm going to do this here so it's larger. No, that sucks. Anyway, if you can see right there at the bottom. I'm going to add this, and this essentially override the default PID's limit that we have on Docker. By default, we actually have a reasonable default. I think it's 512, which actually matches, or it's okay for most applications. But it takes a little bit more time to actually converge. So I use this as an example. I'm limiting to 100 PIDs this particular bash shell on Ubuntu. Okay, so now that I have this Ubuntu bash shell, I'm going to do the following. Jesus Christ. There we go. I have a fork bomb right here, right? So we have our fork bomb. I think you're all familiar with this. We all have been kids. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy paste, and I copy pasted this fork bomb, which essentially what it does is it's essentially bash for unlimited processes running by themselves and forking it to the background. So what this is going to do is, as long as it can, is going to create processes and processes and processes and processes. And I could demo this. I can demo at the end. If I demo this outside of a Docker container, you're going to see my Mac crashing. If I demo this inside of a Docker container, let's see what happens. I hope it doesn't crash. Okay, running it. So okay, so you see immediately there's no child processes, and there's stuff happening there. And so something is happening, right? What's happening is it's trying to create processes, and Docker is saying, nope, you can create more, you can create more, you can create more. And it's essentially trying to fight the resources temporarily unavailable, right? So instead of killing it now, I'm just going to run it in the background so you can see that I'm actually not hiding anything. And so I'm going to go over here to another shell, and this one is still running, right? No shell processes in the background, just like trying to create infinite processes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run and demo you the Docker benchmark, right? The Docker benchmark should tell me that something is wrong, right? I have one container that is going completely haywire, so there should be something there. The way that you run the Docker benchmark is you essentially run a container itself, and you give it privileges. In this case, you're giving it the Docker socket. And what this allows allows the Docker benchmark to actually evaluate your whole system. So effectively, by the way, this is dangerous, right? You're giving it root. By giving it the socket, you're giving access to everything. You could limit this more. But assuming you trust the origin of this container, and this container is signed, assuming you trust the origin of this container, then this is okay, because I actually built it. So if you trust me, you should probably trust me if you're running Docker. So I'm going to run this. And what this is going to do is essentially going to run Docker Bench and did a bunch of stuff, right? And so in particular, we're running a fork bomb on the other one. Let's go to the other one. Oh, we're still running the fork bomb. That still looks good. So let's see what Docker Bench actually has to tell us about this host. Well, number one, there's apparently a container running as root called Happy Tesla, which is our fork bomb. It's running as root. It doesn't have an AppArmor profile, which is not good. It's not verifying SE Linux options, which is also not good. And funny enough, it's running too many processes. I wonder why. It's also not limited in terms of memory and CPU, not limited in terms of mount, and apparently I have 100 containers, and 2 of them only are running. Okay, so let's go back, and let's try to exit this thing. It exits cleanly. I just fork bomb a container, and I was able to just simply exit. This is something that is completely unheard of in my history of 20 years of administering Linux systems. Every time I ran one of these things, it was a race to Control-C, or the machine would die in seconds. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so now let me demo you something else. I want to demo you seccomp. I talked a lot about seccomp and said that it was really important. Seccomp is, if you recall, the way that we have to limit the kernel exposure, right? Seccomp allows us to block system calls. But what does that actually look like? Well, I have a couple demos for you. In one of them, I have a file called sleep.json, okay? This sleep.json is an incredibly simple seccomp policy. It has 2 main components. Number 1, by default, you allow things. Easy enough. Number 2, if this syscall gets called, you error out. Okay? Simple enough. So I'm going to run an Alpine container. Alpine, for those of you that don't know, Alpine is a really good, typing with one hand is awful. It's a really good small minimal distribution that you should be running your containers with. So instead of running everything with Ubuntu or running with like some big, really large images, you should always use minimal images. And Alpine is a really good security-oriented Alpine image that we use. It's about 5 megs. And so with 5 megs, you get a really good system with BusyBox and a really good package manager. And you should build all of your apps from Alpine, always. That's what I do. So I'm going to run an sh BusyBox inside of Alpine. Now I'm going to do this. I'm going to do the sleep command, okay? Sleep, and I'm going to sleep for 5 seconds. So we can see that it's actually sleeping, right? It's going to wait 5 seconds, and it's actually going to return. Okay, that's sleep command. That's great. So why is this interesting? This is interesting because sleep uses a system call. Sleep uses nanosec syscall. And so if you go back to this, it's actually right there, uses the nanosleep right there. And I know that because I've tried this before. So nanosleep is a system call that sleep tries to use. And with this profile, if I load it, sleep should not be able to sleep. So you can actually remove the ability from a container from sleeping. All of your bash scripts that do sleep, they all go away. All of your C programs that do sleep, they all go away. The container can't do nanosleep. So let's try to load this profile. So we're going to do that by doing sleep.json right there. So we're going to do the following. We're going to run Docker, and we're going to say that there's a security option, which is seccomp, and I'm going to point it to sleep.json. And sleep.json is just that file, okay? So if I run that, now I'm inside of the container, and I do sleep, and let's do sleep for 10 seconds. Nope, that was not 10 seconds. Nope, that was still not 10 seconds. What's happening in the background is that sleep is actually getting an error, and it's just bailing because it can't do anything else. So we just effectively removed the ability from this container and any application inside of it from sleeping. But sleeping doesn't seem particularly useful, though. So let's do something a little bit more useful. Let's actually cat this one. Exact same behavior, right? Let me GQ this. OK, so we have this policy over here. By default is allow, and we're going to get to there. Socket, error out. Okay, so if I run the Alpine again, and I'm going to run the Alpine without anything, And I'm going to do the following. I'm going to NC. I'm going to use netcat. And I'm going to listen on a port. Cool. It works, right? It's listening on a port 34554. Okay. So now let's do the exact same thing for socket. Let's load that policy. If we load that policy right there, security option, socket policy. If I now go and try to netcat -v-l, operation not permitted. So we just took the ability of the container from doing actual call completely. It's the lowest level of kernel control that you could have. If there was an exploit on this system call, this exploit can't run because the kernel doesn't allow the system call to actually be executed. Nobody can pass parameters to it. So this is a really cool protection for you to actually run. And I also talked about capabilities. And I also talked about how you can actually take capabilities away from the root in the system. Let me quickly show you that by doing the following. I'm going to run an Alpine container, and I'm going to do cap drop. Cap drop is a feature flag for Docker that allows you to drop capabilities. You also have the opposite equivalent, which is cap add. And you could actually, by the way, do cap drop all. And you can run stuff inside of a cap drop all container. It won't do very useful things, but it'll actually be very secure. So in this case, I'm dropping shown. And what's going to happen is, now that I'm running inside of an Alpine container with shown, or without shown, I'm going to touch a file. I'm going to touch a file called blah. And now I'm going to show you that I am root. ID, root, right there. Can't be more root than this, right? There's no more root than this. This is all. I am God inside of this container. Yet, if I try to shown, no body. Oh, Jesus Christ. Writing with one hand is awful. I'm a fast typer, by the way. No body, and I'm going to try to do this to blah. Whoops. That is embarrassing right there. There we go. Cool. Here we go. Operation not permitted. So I showed you two totally different ways of both mitigating and removing hardcore capabilities from inside of the containers. I can actually show you a very useful implementation of this on a WordPress blog. As we all know, WordPress is not really the most secure system out there. And so this Docker containers are amazing to run WordPress in. Why? You can do things like take shown away. People can't upload files and shown them. What is the first thing that hackers do when they send a binary to a remote host? They shown +x so they can run the backdoor. They can't run the backdoor. What if I do -- read only? I can actually run Docker in a way that no writes to disk are possible. Let's try that out. Let's go here and do -- read only. Okay, so you saw me touching a file before, right? Whoops. I no longer can touch that file. So now imagine that I have a web server front end or a proxy or a WordPress that can't upload plugins. A remote file inclusion no longer works if I upload a plugin, right? I can't write a PHP backdoor shell if I can write to the file system. So right now, from the perspective of this container, there's literally nowhere that it can actually write. So these are really powerful tools for you to actually use. Okay, so finally, I wanted to show you something else. I showed you seccomp policies in, there we go. There we go. So I showed you seccomp policies, and I showed you all the seccomp policies starting with allow, right? So that would be a blacklist model, right? I blacklisted nanosleep and I blacklisted socket. And in this case, for Docker specifically, our system actually operates in a whitelist fashion. So you can see the actual default action right here of the Docker profile. How do I, is this working? Yeah, it's working. It's just really slow. Okay, you can see that the default profile for the Docker profile is actually error. So we inverted the model. We are a whitelist model. And these are all the system calls that right now your container works with. And this is a default policy. You can always override this and use something else. Okay, so another thing that is actually really exciting and that we're really passionate about is not only Docker should have all these security features, not only these security features should come by default to help you, but the content that you're using should be signed with Docker Content Trust, with hardware, with all these advanced features, but the content itself also has to be scanned and protected. So we've created something called Nautilus. It's actually coming out for public availability next month. But Nautilus essentially does deep content inspection, not only vulnerabilities, but a lot more than that. And so I wanted to give you a demo, a sneak peek, because I think you guys are going to find it cool, of something that we've been running, Nautilus, in the background for the past 6 months. If you've used an official image from Docker, you've been protected by Nautilus, and you've been scanned, and we have collaborated with the upstream providers of these containers to make sure that the vulnerabilities get fixed. So this is just a Docker Hub you probably have already used and seen the Docker Hub, except that I have some special privileges. And on my Explorer, I'm actually going to see some different things. So on my Explorer, I see all the official images. These are all Docker official images, Docker sign, Docker build. So these are the official images that you should actually trust. And so if I click the first official image, let's say Nginx, and I click tags, something appears. Every single tag of Nginx has been scanned every time that there's a difference, and essentially every hour for vulnerabilities. And you can see the pattern here, right? The fact that vulnerabilities in red exists doesn't mean that it's bad, right? It means that we're carrying an old version. So Nginx 1.8 obviously has more vulnerabilities than Nginx 1.9. Why? Because 1.9 fixed some of the 1.8 vulnerabilities, and so on and so forth. And so if you see these are the actual backported releases that are all green that you're actually using. So if you're using Nginx latest, then we're sure that you're not running any vulnerabilities, and we can show you that the prior versions were actually running. And so let's actually click into some of these. For example, let's click the first one, or the last one, doesn't matter, latest, right here. So it's a lot more than just content scanning. What this is giving you is a layer-by-layer play of exactly what is running inside of your container. Even when you have no vulnerable components, we're enumerating every single component that got added to your container. Look, libpcap with the actual BSD model right there. Red line is GPL v3. So we even know the licenses of the things that are importing, because for companies, it's important to know if you're running a license that you shouldn't. And so all of these things, no known vulnerabilities, you see all of this gray, but you are doing a lot more than vulnerability inspection. You actually understand what's in your system. If there's an incompatible version, if there's a version of something that you want to look for, then you can do it because you have layer by layer play. Again, this is just one layer. It came from this. It came from this file. Note that this is not an apt-get. This is not like other content scanning mechanisms that only work when you use a package manager and then compare the CVE vulnerability with the package manager. It's not what's happening here. We actually are looking at the files. We're looking at binaries. We're looking at every single system that is inside of every single layer. And we're trying to see if there's something statically compiled, dynamically compiled, if there's a jar that got flattened with some vulnerable OpenSSL inside of it. We're looking at everything. And so this one has no vulnerabilities, but we can see more layers. We can see maintainer. We can see Nginx version. And then we can see this right here. And you can see that the apt-get, update, install, what is actually running, added some vulnerable packages. You can see here there has one critical vulnerability, two major vulnerabilities. And I click down, and I have a play-by-play. Same exact thing that I had when I had no vulnerabilities. I now know all the CVEs and the severity of every single layer and every single utility and package that I have. So this is how we actually protect your content. And this is how the Docker official content is actually protected right now. And we've been doing this for more than 6 months. And this is an incredibly fun project that I love demoing because only I can see this. This is going to be public for general availability next month. This is going to be a component of our business model. I'm not sure how the people are going to actually do that. But there's going to be a charged version, I believe, on the, and don't quote me on this, I believe on the private repositories are going to include this by default. So if you have a private repository, you get this. And then eventually there's going to be an on-prem solution that your company can actually deploy internally. We also have a Docker Trusted Registry, which is our commercial platform for you to run your containers on-prem inside of your companies, on your own cloud, and it's going to be integrated with that. So that's kind of like the business model component. But focusing on tech, this is actually really fucking cool. And we're using a ton of stuff on the back end. We're not using only our own ingrown scanning features. We're also using other commercial features, and we're aggregating everything, weeding out the false positives, and then having some really cool dashboards that can actually show you everything that is happening. So with this, I would end my presentation, and I hope I didn't take too long, and I would open up for questions. Thank you very much. Questions?
Question. You said that with privilege, we can restrict access with the UUID external. Not
Username
zero.
spaces.
Can you go back again to that, please?
Sure. Username spaces. Is this what you want?
Yeah. So how does it work? If your privilege Docker socket, and so you should be root even inside the
So
host. Right?
what is happening here is not, it has nothing to do with the Docker socket itself. What is happening here is when you run a container and you run a container as root, which means that you, on the Docker file, you put nothing without privilege. Without privilege. You can't run user namespaces with privileged. If you're privileged, you have access to memory. If you're privileged, you have access to disk. It's essentially an impossibility thing, is you're trying to give something and take something away, but you can't. So this means that you can't run with privileged. You should walk around privilege as much as you can. Privilege is essentially saying that I screwed up, I have this old legacy application, and I don't care to change it, and it can't work anywhere else. Put it inside of a VM somewhere and run it in isolation. But privilege is essentially saying, I don't care about this. This works for everything else. So it works for when you don't put a user specifically on a Docker file, and by default runs as root. It no longer runs as root. That's essentially what it's for. So it's 99% of the use cases of everybody running containers as root. You're welcome.
I have a question about the, in general, I mean, about the multi-tenancy, container multi-tenancy. So when or do you think it's because currently we are renting VMs and running Docker containers inside. Do you think if and when it will be possible to actually run containers directly, right, without VMs?
So I mean, the answer is you can do it right now, right? It depends on the use case. For example, I have customers and people that run 1,500 machines, and their 1,500 machines is essentially a cluster that is essentially their Hadoop, right? They don't need multi-tenancy from one Hadoop to the other Hadoop, right? So the reality is that they're running all of Docker containers on bare metal, and they're taking the huge advantages from they're not losing performance because they're not running VMs. So the reality, it is use case dependent. But on the use cases where you want multi-tenancy, but you don't want to run a VM, the answer is authorization plugins and authentication plugins allow you to do that yourself. But I think the interesting thing there is that people have, we've gave you all the tools. The tools are there. You can use it. Authorization plugin is actually going to be merged in Docker 112, which allows you to integrate with external Kerberos, integrate with LDAP. But authorization plugins allow you to do multi-tenancy effectively because they allow you to hand a user to Docker, and then your plugin does whatever it needs. It can call to LDAP, can call to Kerberos, can call to whatever it is, and decide, do I run? Do I not run? What do I run? What do I return? So the answer to you is you already have the capabilities. But unfortunately, you're going to have to build them yourself. And the reason why you're going to have to build them yourself is because there's this commercial version of everybody that is trying to sell you an orchestration engine. And the reality is that the authorization has to be at the orchestration level. Right? It doesn't make sense for you to have one Docker daemon that is master and lord of its own multi-tenancy environment because nobody's running one machine, right? We're all running millions of machines or thousands of machines. Even if you're running 10 machines, you want this kind of utility. So the reality is that authorization is built into Docker for the orchestration engines to use. And so the orchestration engines, like we have one, Universal Control Plane already does that. So today, you can run containers on bare metal without virtual machines, with Docker containers, completely multi-tenant, without users seeing anything, but it's a commercial platform, right? Go ahead. So the risk for them to escape isolation is for them to beat essentially the security features that we're talking about, right? So it's for them to essentially find a local kernel escalation. And after finding a local escalation, so a 0-day, they're going to have to essentially walk around the system calls, and they have to find an escalation bug on one of your system calls. And after they try to escape, and you didn't use user namespaces, so they're actually a privileged user on the host, they're going to have to try to walk around the LSMs and all the other protections that you have and trying to go around the max. It's a matter of configuration. I can't tell you how easy it is, because if I knew how easy it is and if I knew a specific bug, I would fix it. So right now, I don't know of any way of doing it, but I would think about it the same way that I think about VMs. Yeah. VMs have one unique advantage, which is they have VTD and VTX support in hardware. So they can actually do the memory paging and isolation in hardware. Containers don't have that right now. With things like SGX coming in the near future, with Intel processors, it actually is going to get there in 2 to 3 years. But right now, we don't have hardware isolation. The other interesting thing, though, is that containers actually help you with the application security, and virtual machines don't. For example, in a virtual machine, you can't say run this as read-only, or you can't say don't allow chmod, or don't allow shown. So in a virtual machine, your WordPress would get popped. In a container, your WordPress would not get popped. So this is a fundamental difference. We're thinking about infrastructure security when we should be thinking about application security. And containers give you application security, and virtual machines give you infrastructure security. So they're actually two different beasts. Great question, though.
So you've been taking out capabilities when running the container. Can you like put defaults into the image also?
So we're creating something called security profiles. The answer to that question is no. You can't. Image is an image, and then it's a runtime configuration. What do you actually do? You have defaults, and you can do a default across your daemon, but you can't do on a per image basis. What we're trying to build is something called security profiles. Security profiles are essentially something that gets bundled with an image that gets built by the publisher, not the developer. So the person that does WordPress, the person that does Nginx, the upstream person that is responsible for this software is going to come up with a default policy that they think it's reasonable for their software. And they're going to describe it in a security profile. And the security profile has everything. It has Macs, has capabilities, has user namespaces, has seccomp, has everything built into it. And so with this profile, your image runs with the default or with something else if you want to override it. So it's actually pretty interesting from that case because it does exactly what you want. It is a per image segregation model, which is actually really powerful, but doesn't exist today, and we're trying to work towards it. All the pieces are there, and they're security opts. If you think about it, you can run security opts, but they're not tied to the image. And we're trying to find a good way to tying it to an image and having a default image security configuration that runs alongside with it.
There's a link with your answer. But how do you choose which capabilities and seccomp you allow or not allow? And is it something you do with others, or you are doing it only at Docker because you think it's
No, so these things come on by default, right? So by default, you have less than half of the capabilities right here. So this is the current status quo. If you run Docker 111, this is what you get. This is what Linux does.
But how do you choose which capabilities?
So for on the Docker, so I'm trying to support as many use cases as possible, right? And so Docker defaults will be secure by default for you, but you can always tie them down because you know what your application is actually trying to do. I don't, right? So what I do to decide these is I essentially run every single image on the Docker Hub public, and I go through every single tried possibility of capabilities in seccomp, et cetera, and I see what fails because I can. So that's how I see like, oh, I'm going to break 1% of images, or I'm going to break 5% of images. And now I can do essentially trade-off analysis of, is this worth it for security to break 95% of images? Maybe not. Maybe it is. But for you, what you can do is, remember that containers are still PIDs. They're still running in Linux. So you can strace them. You can actually literally see all the system calls that any process is doing with strace. And then from that, we actually have a few scripts that we included in Docker that you can process those logs and creates a security profile out of it. So it creates a minimal, least privilege seccomp profile of only the system calls that it saw. It might not be exhaustive because there might have been a system call that didn't get executed while you were trying to test it, but it's a really good first default. And when it fails, you know what system call failed, and then you add it. So this is how people actually do it. And people are using this, so it's definitely not just Docker. We actually eat our own dog food, and we run with the defaults.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, you just answered the question. My question was, do you plan to have any kind of audit tools to trace the capabilities and the syscalls that are used by a running container?
So I mean, that's a great question. I don't think we're going to have to like. So again, this is Linux, right? Sysdig does this, strace does this, ptrace does this. We've had these tools for a long time, which is cool. We know how to do this. We're all sysadmins. We know how to do this, which is cool. I think it's one of the powerful things about Docker. If you really want to dig, you know what the fundamentals are, and you can change them and tune them. But for us, it's not as much about building these tools. It's about as long as the ecosystem has some kind of tool that they can do it accurately, and we can help them get there, then everybody else is safer. And that's what we're trying to get at. If I have to be the one building it, I will, if nobody else does. But if something like Sysdig, and we're collaborating with a lot of security startups, they're coming to this space, and if they want to play ball with me, I essentially say, look, I would like you to do this. For example, authorization plugins came from an external company, right? I said, look, I don't have time to build this particular thing. This is the spec. This is what I want. And they go to the open source and contribute. And I do that a lot with other security companies. And some security companies like, okay, you're building this policy engine, Policy engine maps to a security profile, or policy engine maps to a seccomp capability, so people can import it directly into Docker. And as long as you can do that, I'll play ball. And so I'm trying to shape the actual ecosystem for us to actually move all in the right direction instead of all trying to rebuild the same things.
I have time for one last question, and then we can continue the discussion with the pizzas.
Sounds good.
So YubiKey support is in today, and the other question is, do you have a short demo on that?
YubiKey support is in today. I screwed up my laptop, and this Mac actually does not support YubiKeys because I don't have USBs. If I had a USB, yes. The YubiKey is a really cool demo, but it's actually not that cool. The only thing that you see is me touching it from the outside. But they're really small, right? You don't even see them because they're really, really small. So if you look at this, where is this thing? If you look at these YubiKey Neos, this is the only thing you see. This little thing. So this is all covered because this is all the USB connection. You only see this little thing, and it blinks green, and it's great. And when it asks you to touch, I can show people the blinking, and it blinks, and then I touch it and it stops blinking. So that's kind of like the interaction. I can show you Docker Content Trust, which is the exact same thing, but without the actual touching. But you can probably run that yourself. We have some online instructions on how to use YubiKeys, how to store keys in YubiKeys, and the tool Notary is a tool that we built. So the way that we built security for distribution of images was we decided, instead of being prescriptive and saying, no, Docker is going to be a monolith and ship with this thing, what we did was we built an open source version of something called Notary. Notary does all the heavy lifting for security, for signing of images, support for hardware, the update framework, all of that stuff. And then we essentially integrated Docker with that as we would with any other external vendor library. So right now you can actually use Notary without Docker at all. You can use hardware keys with Notary without Docker at all. Right? So from our perspective, this is actually just another contribution for the community. It's just another open source project, the same way that Docker itself is open source. So you can go play with it. We have some really pretty good docs. I've been pushing a lot on docs, and we just released. We're about to release 0.3, but with the latest version can do delegations and do all sorts of threshold signing and super cool crypto stuff. Perfect. Thank you very much.